Two giants of gospel, Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp, men whose voices have carried hope across the world and whose ministries have touched millions, are now at the center of a revelation no one expected. Behind the songs, the sermons, and the global influence lies a shocking truth that has just come to light, one that could change how fans see them forever. For decades, McClurkin and Sapp have been admired as untouchable icons, celebrated not only for their music but for the power of their testimonies and the reach of their ministries. But what's being whispered now goes beyond music, beyond church, and straight into territory that has left the gospel community stunned. This isn't just another headline, this is the kind of story that shakes faith, sparks questions, and forces everyone to wonder, how well do we really know our heroes? For years, quiet whispers of a secret feud between Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp have echoed through the gospel world, but now the silence is finally breaking. What really happened behind closed doors? Why did two of gospel's most celebrated voices drift apart? And more importantly, what does this long-buried tension reveal about the gospel industry itself? Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear could forever change the way you see Donnie and Marvin. When you hear the names Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp, you think of gospel greatness. Donnie, with timeless anthems like Stand and We Fall Down, has carried generations through hardship with his music. Marvin, with his soul-stirring hit, Never Would Have Made It, became one of the most recognizable voices in gospel history. Together, they shaped the modern sound of gospel, inspired millions, and built legacies few can rival. But behind the Grammy Awards, the sold-out concerts, and the powerful sermons, there has always been a quiet storm, rumors of a tension that insiders say was impossible to ignore. And now, the truth is finally starting to come to light. Tension that neither man discussed in public. The quiet grew stronger over time, but fans dismissed it as hearsay. Despite being in the same circles, why were these two gospel titans rarely seen together? Why didn't fans seem to get their requests for partnerships fulfilled? And now, after years of conjecture, information of their conflict is starting to come to light. Some claim that personal misunderstandings were the cause. Some argue it went deeper into issues of ministry, business, and trust, while others say it was about competitiveness in the gospel industry. No matter what the reality is, one thing is for sure: the covert conflict between Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp is far more nuanced than anyone had anticipated. We will dissect everything in this video, from the beginnings of their friendship to the quiet distance that developed between them to the startling information that was just revealed. We'll examine this subject from all angles. The gospel community's unexpected responses, the hidden realities, and the potent lessons this rivalry teaches about forgiveness, faith, and celebrity will astound you. This is where things become fascinating, though. One of the most significant unsaid realities in the gospel industry might be revealed by what began as rumors of conflict. You'll see why this feud is about far more than just two men by the end of this film. We are all moved by the struggles that go into the music. We must first examine how their paths crossed and how their connection began in order to fully see how a quarrel between Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp could possibly exist. On the surface, it seemed like both men were meant to use gospel music to transform lives. On the inside, however, their paths diverged greatly, disparities that might have sowed the first seeds of conflict. In the mid-1990s, Donnie McClurkin gained popularity because to his self-titled debut album, which featured singles like Stand, his music was honest about his own hardships and was unvarnished and intensely emotive. He was one of the most relatable characters in gospel music because he talked candidly about pain, brokenness, and redemption. Donnie gained not just notoriety for his testimony, but also for his strong voice, a man who had endured suffering and emerged from it with more faith. Before embarking on a solo career that would ultimately lead to enormous success, Marvin Sapp began his career as a member of the gospel ensemble Commissioned. He shot to international stardom with his 2007 hit song, Never Would Have Made It, which became a cultural anthem and made it into mainstream charts. One of Marvin's strengths was his ability to connect with people outside of the church through worshipful ballads. He had a refined sound, a steady image, and a growing reputation as a leader and pastor in addition to his musical career. Although each man was a formidable force in his own right, their approaches to ministry and even their mannerisms differed. Donnie was feisty, vocal, and unafraid to start discussions on touchy subjects. Marvin was frequently regarded as calm, steady, and committed to developing his music and his Michigan church, Lighthouse Full Life Center, their paths inherently crossed in spite of these distinctions. They frequently take place in the same locations as award presentations like the Gospel Music Workshops and the Stellar Awards. The notion of Donnie and Marvin working together was adored by fans. They were, after all, two of the most well-known figures in gospel, each controlling arenas and reaching the top of the charts. Some of the most famous gospel moments in history might have been produced by their combined impact. However, this is when the narrative takes an intriguing turn. Although fans anticipated intimacy, insiders observed that Donnie and Marvin were rarely spotted lending support to one another's endeavors. Seldom did they appear on the same stage. Despite having a lot in common, their references to one another in interviews were courteous but distinctly cold, as though there was respect but no warmth. The majority of fans didn't give it much thought at the time. After all, there are a lot of demanding ministries and hectic schedules in the gospel world. Not all artists are able to be great pals. Nevertheless, many who listened closely started to wonder, why aren't Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp closer? Given how much they have in common, the basis of their relationship or lack thereof was laid during these early years of parallel success. Although they were never overtly antagonistic, their relationships appeared to be carefully regulated, as though an imperceptible barrier separated them. And that invisible wall would only get taller as both men gained more notoriety and power. However, what followed transformed rumors into conjecture, because when Donnie and Marvin's careers took off, hints of conflict that went beyond simple differences in personality or hectic schedules started to show. People would soon conclude that a silent feud was taking place behind the scenes as a result of those early indications. Fans sensed something out of the ordinary as Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp's careers took off in the gospel sector. It was evident that they did not publicly collaborate, even though they were two of the most well-known gospel musicians. Donnie and Marvin maintained an unexpectedly high level of distance from one another, despite the fact that many musicians in the business were ready to provide support by sharing stages at important events, appearing on albums, or sending encouraging messages on social media. It was initially dismissed as a coincidence. Both men were really busy after all. Donnie was singing all over the world and serving as the pastor of Perfecting Faith Church in New York. After Never Would Have Made It became a global hymn, Marvin was riding the tide of enormous success while also leading his expanding flock in Michigan. But over time, it was more difficult to ignore their silence. The fans started to ask questions. Donnie and Marvin had never recorded a duet. Why was that? Why, unlike many gospel leaders, were they not spotted preaching at each other's churches? Despite being two of the most well-known figures in the same field, why were their names hardly ever mentioned together in interviews? These inquiries fueled the answers, and curiosity were not forthcoming. Some industry sources subtly hinted that schedule issues could not have been the only issue. Competitive rumors began to circulate. Donnie and Marvin were both very powerful, both musically and spiritually. They served as pastors, leaders, and authoritative voices in gospel culture in addition to being singers. Of course, such power might lead to conflict. One significant event that sparked conjecture occurred during an awards season in the middle of the 2000s. Both Marvin and Donnie received nominations in important categories. Fans also observed that although both men publicly praised their peers, they did not specifically mention one another. The quiet was stark to gospel audiences used to witnessing public displays of solidarity. It was regarded by some as a subdued indication that there might be unresolved conflict between the two. Interviews provided yet another nuanced, yet informative moment. Known for speaking out, Donnie McClurkin frequently addressed contentious topics both within and outside of the church. Marvin, meanwhile, was more circumspect, picking his comments carefully to keep up a polished public front. Donnie has discussed the importance of authenticity in gospel ministry in interviews over the years. Some fans conjectured that the remarks were veiled criticisms of other business titans. Even though he never specifically mentioned Marvin, others took his remarks as a jab at Sapp's sophisticated industry's astute strategy. Conversely, Marvin talked about the difficulties of competitiveness in gospel music on occasion. He once said that musicians sometimes prioritize fame over ministry, which some thought might have been a reference to vocal people like Donnie. The timing of these remarks, whether deliberate or not, only strengthened fan speculation that something more serious was in the works. Then there was the issue of closeness. Marvin and Donnie both belonged to the same prominent social circles. They took turns speaking at important gospel events, award ceremonies, and even foreign tours. But there weren't many pictures of them together. Additionally, their interactions were courteous but aloof when they did present in the same area. It was never the kind of loving fraternal love that fans had anticipated. The whispers were getting louder by now. Did Marvin Sapp and Donnie McClurkin purposefully avoid one another? Was it work-related, personal, or both? There was a void left by the public's lack of information, and rumors filled that void. It was jealousy over record sales, they said. Others blamed it on disagreements in ministry. Marvin is more methodical and business-minded, whereas Donnie is more gregarious and unfiltered. Some even implied that previous miscommunications had created scars that neither man wanted to discuss. One thing, though, was for sure: the stillness had changed. It was perceived as a rivalry that was subtly brewing beneath the gospel community's surface. And over time, the slight indications of conflict would intensify into unmistakable clues that something was seriously amiss between these two titans of the gospel. This is where the fans were really taken aback. Both Donnie and Marvin would soon start giving clues, small but impactful words and deeds after years of rejecting the rumors, seemingly confirming what the gospel community had long assumed. The unusual friendship between Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp was the subject of years of mostly unspoken rumors. Insiders whispered that, while fans conjectured, no hard evidence had been verified. All of that started to shift in the late 2110s when faint fissures in the facade of stillness began to show. The first indication was a string of public gatherings that made it impossible to overlook the lack of cooperation. One of the most obvious instances occurred at a significant celebration of the gospel anniversary. The industry's brightest names came together for a star-studded gala. For unforgettable duets, artists with a long history together graced the stage. In moments that fans would remember for years, CeCe Winans, Kirk Franklin, Yolanda Adams, and Hezekiah Walker were all matched with other superstars. However, Donnie and Marvin never shared the stage when they were called upon separately. Why haven't Donnie and Marvin sung together yet? And it feels like there's something they're not telling us, were among the remarks that flooded social media after domestic viewers took note. The interviews followed. Direct and indirect questions concerning their contemporaries in the gospel industry were posed to both men. In keeping with his openness, Donnie talked about how the industry had become less genuine. He emphasized the significance of not just performing for attention, but also living what one preaches. Although he didn't mention specific people, his remarks were powerful in a field where reputation and image were crucial. According to several followers, Marvin Sapp, whose career had exploded into widespread stardom after never having made it, was the direct target of these comments. In the meantime, Marvin discussed the perils of ego in ministry in interviews. Although it wasn't always advantageous for the kingdom, he said that some artists thrived on being controversial or outspoken. Once more, no identities were mentioned, but both insiders and fans came to their own conclusions. Did Marvin mention Donnie? As every small move was magnified on social media, the unspoken feud became increasingly obvious. The quiet between Donnie and Marvin became deafening in a time when fans expected their favorite artists to express their support online. On Instagram and Twitter, both men enthusiastically praised other musicians by congratulating them on record releases, church openings, or other noteworthy occasions. Interestingly, though, they hardly ever, if ever, praised one another in their timelines. Fans who were paying attention received a clear message from this lack of recognition. There was a problem. When rumors of private disputes started to circulate, the situation worsened. Some insiders claimed that Donnie and Marvin had argued because they had different philosophies about ministering. It was reported that Donnie, who frequently discussed openness and vulnerability, didn't agree with what he perceived to be Marvin's more formal, businesslike approach to pastoring and music. Marvin, however, was said to have believed that Donnie's candidness occasionally caused needless conflict in the gospel community, endangering its legitimacy. Although they were never discussed openly, these purported disparities appeared to account for the years of separation. One instance that stood out was when both guys were set to appear at a leadership seminar. The fact that the attendees' sessions were arranged back-to-back but not together caught their attention. Donnie and Marvin did not appear together, although other leaders co-hosted panels or had private conversations. The fact that many supporters had pleaded with the organizers to place the two together on stage made this even more obvious. Rather, the incident kept them apart with care. This action, whether intentional or not, stoked rumors that the rift was serious. Gospel blogs and media sites started looking more closely as the rumors persisted. Are Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp avoiding each other? And the gospel feud nobody wants to talk about were among the headline concerns. Neither guy openly acknowledged or refuted these reports, but their silence only strengthened the veracity of the rumors. Indeed, others contended that Donnie and Marvin were subtly confirming what fans already suspected by remaining silent. However, the gospel community itself may have revealed the most startling information. Other musicians started making cryptic remarks about the lack of unity among gospel leaders without specifically mentioning Donnie or Marvin. The world sees our unity on stage, but behind closed doors, it's a different story, one singer said in an interview, pointing out that the industry has too many secret rivalries. Given how conspicuously absent Sapp and McClurkin were from one another's platforms, many interpreted this as a subtle jab against them. The perfect storm was the result of all of this. What started out as soft murmurs became indisputable sound. The trend was too obvious for fans to ignore anymore. The absence of cooperation, the oblique remarks, the obvious separation in public gatherings, and the total lack of support for one another. What used to be referred to as a rumor was now commonly believed to be true. A long-suppressed enmity between Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp has finally come to light. However, the plot takes an even more unexpected turn at this point, since the facts that would eventually come to light revealed something even deeper, something that touched not just on music but also on the very core of ministry and personal belief. Fans believed they understood the reasons behind the divide: competition, philosophy, and ego. Two men were no longer at the center of the rivalry. It was starting to reflect the challenges that the gospel business as a whole was facing. And the gospel community learned that this quarrel had far more important lessons than anyone had anticipated when the first cracks of confession appeared. Fans were clamoring for clarification by the time rumors of Donnie McClurkin and Marvin Sapp's dispute peaked. Why would two gospel icons, who seemed to have a lot in common, keep their distance from one another? What prevented their ministries from ever intersecting as supporters had hoped? What made the quiet seem so deliberate? As it happened, the truth was more complicated than a single argument. Personal background, ministry ideology, and even the demands of the gospel music industry itself were all factors. First, conflicting philosophies in ministry. A conflict of worldviews was the root of their tension. Donnie McClurkin has a reputation for being unvarnished. He freely discussed his testimony, his hardships, and the difficulties of being a Christian. His openness to discussing his own struggles with faith, family, and sin made him sympathetic. But it also sparked debate. While some praised his openness, others felt he said too much. Marvin Sapp, on the other hand, established his reputation by projecting a more refined and cautious persona. His ministry placed a strong emphasis on competence, professionalism, and structure. He made sure his church and music brand had a constant, professional look by emphasizing stability and respectability in his role as pastor. Millions were drawn to this strategy, but some others said it felt overly corporate. Insiders claimed that this disparity in strategy caused conflict. According to reports, Donnie thought Marvin's image was too meticulously constructed, too sterile, and too vulnerable. Marvin, however, apparently believed that Donnie's candor harmed pastor's reputation by bringing needless debate into gospel settings. It has nothing to do with right or wrong. There was only a basic divergence in their views on how the gospel ought to be preached. Second, the gospel sector is competitive. Despite the fact that both men based their ministry on their faith, their relationship was undoubtedly characterized by competitiveness. Like any other industry, the gospel music sector is not immune to competition. Chart positions, award nominations, and album sales were used as benchmarks. Marvin's never would have made. It is said to have caused quite concern when it broke down borders and became a crossover hit, reaching a wider audience. Already, Donnie was legendary. However, Marvin's ascent changed the focus in ways that made some people wonder if Donnie felt overshadowed. Donnie's outspoken style, television appearances, and daring presence in leadership circles occasionally thrust him into the spotlight in ways Marvin didn't feel comfortable contending with. According to industry insiders, this led to an implicit rivalry rather than one of outright animosity. It seems that each individual stood for a distinct kind of gospel. Marvin, the prosperous and polished pastor; Donnie, the vulnerable and prophetic leader. That silent rivalry subtly fueled distance for years. 3. individual miscommunications. In addition to industry dynamics and public perception, there were individual miscommunications. Rumor had it that both men had once been vying for the same leadership positions at prominent gospel conferences and gatherings. Whispers claims that choices on who would lead or headline left one or the other feeling left out. Stories of poor communication also surfaced. There have been occasions when one party reached out and the other did not reply, or when one party anticipated public support, but it never materialized. Whether deliberate or not, these little slights accumulated over time. Additionally, silence might be construed as rejection in a field where every action is exaggerated. The fourth is the gospel community's role. The response from the gospel community further complicated the feud. Many leaders chose to sidestep the issue rather than confront the conflict head-on. In order to avoid picking sides, Donnie and Marvin's friends decided to remain neutral. The problem was exacerbated by this avoidance, which let rumors run amok. In private, a few gospel musicians acknowledged that the biggest issue was the separation between Donnie and Marvin. They couldn't deny it was evident, but they didn't want to become involved. Fans also took note, and the ambiguity further strengthened the idea that something was seriously off. 5. The admissions that made all the difference. But it was when Donnie and Marvin started discussing conflict in ambiguous but illuminating ways that the discourse really changed. In one sermon, Donnie talked of being betrayed in ministry and being harmed by individuals he used to think of as brothers. Although Jesus didn't mention specific names, many people thought he was speaking of other gospel leaders, and those rumors were soon linked to Marvin's name. In an interview, Marvin discussed the challenges of sustaining friendships in the gospel industry. He acknowledged that not everyone who begins as a friend stays close and that relationships might occasionally be hampered by ministry. Once more, no names were stated, but fans were able to make connections because of the timing. These admissions combined to create a picture. Donnie and Marvin had been involved in a personal matter, something that both were reluctant to completely disclose, and that caused wounds. Although their statements didn't explicitly validate the feud, they provided enough context for supporters to think the rumors were